what Warren means by that is that the Civil War is an event, and probably always will be an event, through which Americans have to somehow define themselves. It was the event that first tested and then destroyed the original American Republic. That's really what the war did. The first American Republic, the one born in the 18th century, the one founded in the Revolution, did not last. It was destroyed in this crisis and conflict that led to disunion over slavery and its expansion, and out of the horrifying bloodletting of that war, the scale of which nobody anticipated at its outset, they were really destroying the first union and forced to forge and create and imagine a new one. And the reason Americans had to forge and reimagine a new union, a new nation, a new republic, was because of the destruction of slavery. Emancipation of 4 million slaves. This is what Warren is really signaling in that statement. And he knew it, and he meant it, even as a Southerner. What really forced Americans to reshape the nation was the liberation virtually overnight of 4 million slaves into some kind of new status, some kind of new definition. It forced a rewriting, a redefinition of the U.S. Constitution in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, in the first Civil Rights Acts, in the Reconstruction Acts. It is, in effect, a second American founding. So if we want to understand who we are, when we actually sit down and ask those collective questions, what does it mean to be an American? What is the United States? How is it defined under law? Who are we as a people? What do we mean to the world as a nation? We really are forcing ourselves, if we care, we really are forcing ourselves to go back to the 1860s and understand why that first republic was destroyed, why slavery tore apart the American Union, when it did, and then how and why the country had to find some way to put itself back together, and it had to redefine what America would be. That redefinition comes in the 13th Amendment, which ends slavery, the 14th Amendment, which is arguably the most important thing in our Constitution because it ushered in the Equal Protection Clause and birthright citizenship. That would never have happened. In fact, there never had been a definition of American citizenship until Americans were forced to define who the ex-slaves were. To define them as citizens was the first time Americans had any general definition of citizenship. And then ultimately the 15th Amendment, which was the Voting Rights Amendment. That entire regime of legal constitutional reimagination happened within a handful of years. It was in a sense, as now many historians call it, a second American Revolution. And it was a new revolution. And therefore a kind of, well, it's what Lincoln called it in the Gettysburg Address. It was a new birth. The place was recreating itself. So what Robert PENN WARREN means with that language of, the Civil War being our felt history, or the Civil War being our national oracle, the place we go so often to try to understand, so who are we? Or how does our past speak to us? That's what he really means. Now, it's not the only event we go to for that, obviously. I mean, we've had other major turning points. We constantly today refer to the Great Depression, or the New Deal, or the Second World War, or the Industrial Revolution as a process. There are many places in our past where, when we're thinking in big picture terms, we can go to and begin to understand who we are today, how we've come to where we are. But none more than that most divisive, most destructive, most vexing story of why this country had such an all-out civil war when it had. The great tragedy of Civil War memory in this country is that these two great challenges. On the one hand, healing. The country had to be put back together. You had to develop some kind of culture of healing and a politics of healing. Otherwise, civil wars sometimes never quite end if you don't. The South had to be, reunited some way with the Union. 11 Confederate states had to be redefined, readmitted to the Union, under some kind of unprecedented regime of political imagination. But the other great challenge was the challenge of justice, healing and justice. But the question about justice, of course, was always justice for whom? Justice by whom? Because justice in the wake of this war that kills 600,000 people and maims and wounds more than 1 million and touches every family in the country and leaves the South, parts of the South, in almost utter physical destruction. Justice for white Southerners, or justice for the former slaves, or justice for a family in the North that lost 3 sons, justice to the federal government, justice to the former state of Alabama, all had different answers. Justice for whom? Justice in the minds of a white Georgian who had faced Sherman's March to the Sea and had their land, their farms burned, their land confiscated, and had become starving refugees, was one whole set of answers. Justice to the freed people who have nearly died and survived in contraband camps, who have wandered the back roads and countryside of the interior of the South trying to escape from slavery, or who had stayed on a cotton plantation in South Georgia because there was no way to go, and suddenly in the summer of 1865, they're told they're free, whatever that means. Free to do what? To earn what kind of living? Justice for them was another whole set of answers. It was an unprecedented challenge, frankly, not only for Americans, but it's a model in some ways for other places in the world, before this and especially after, who have faced major civil wars that tear asunder, the fabric of a society, and then, leadership faces the question of how do you put this back together? The great tragedy of Civil War memory and reconciliation is that we never found an adequate way in this society to put healing and justice in a kind of historical balance. You could argue that it wasn't even possible, that healing the nation and forging reconciliation between North and South, forging reconciliation between the veterans of both armies, hundreds of thousands of them, healing those terrible psychological, political, ideological, moral wounds that survived civil wars for generations, and questions of legal justice to people. You could say that, you could never have found a total balance of that. We don't know that. That's the question. That's almost a counterfactual question. Could we have done it this way? Could we have done it that way? But history always makes us try to think about what was done and then what might have been done. In the end, the case is, and what I argued in this book, Race and Reunion, in a sort of layered way, is that in America we reconciled the nation in the decades following the American Civil War on the backs of the former slaves, at the cost of racial justice. We invented and imagined and recreated another kind of racial regime, the Jim Crow system. And in fact, there's simply no way around the fact that the American apartheid, the Jim Crow social, political structure that took hold in the South, ultimately with full complicity from the North by the 1890s and into the 20th century, was part and parcel of the way Americans were putting themselves back together in the wake of the Civil War. Racial justice, the sacrifice of the possibilities of racial justice, was the profound cost of what happened in the remembrance, the formal and informal remembrance of the Civil War. I mean, the lesson in this ultimately, of course, is that how we structure remembering our greatest events, whether it's through our politics, through our schooling, through our popular culture, through memorialization, monument building, rituals, organizations, and so on, how we do that has a profound impact every day in every way on the present in which we live. And in fact, almost all questions, important questions of historical memory, are always about the present. In my new book about the four American writers and the Civil War centennial, it has caused me to think, inevitably, to think about now the Sesquicentennial. I mean, the reason I did this book on Robert PENN WARREN, Bruce Catton, Edmund Wilson, and James Baldwin was in part because I was fascinated by all four of them as writers, and I've always wanted to dig deeper into Robert PENN WARREN and dig deeper into Edmund Wilson and Baldwin and so on. But I found it a way of looking at the 100th anniversary of the Civil War, which was going on in the 1950s and 1960s, as a way of thinking then about, so where are we today as we now confront this 150th anniversary? Why are we so anniversary conscious in this country? And if we are, what has changed in 50 years about our understandings of that event, either in academic history or in the public memory or in schooling or in our politics? And now we live in a time of constant media, 24/7, cable news, the internet, where everybody can be a historian. Every politician, has a story to tell that's historical. Bloggers every day on the internet are doing history. History is everywhere, and everybody can be their own historian. And so there's this kind of roiling historical conversation going on in the United States, whether the issue is immigration, whether the issue is race, whether the issue is, well, we have a black president, what does that mean? Or whether the issue is health care, Social Security, name your major issue. The role of government, let's be even more general. The place of the federal government vis-a-vis the states in the United States. You cannot discuss that question, that ubiquitous American constitutional question of federalism, without, if you have any sense of history, without reflecting back to the Civil War. I mean, of course the Civil War had a lot to do with states' rights, but it was states' rights employed for a particular purpose. It was state sovereignty used for a particular aim. So today, when we have politicians who are currently using the language of states' rights, state sovereignty, we have politicians now who are even using the language of nullification. The governor of Texas, a congressman from Virginia, from South Carolina, from many places, have been arguing that too much power has gone to the federal government. In fact, it's become a political mantra in this country that the federal government is too strong, too powerful. We must reduce it, reduce it, reduce it, reduce it. Well, again, this is why the past matters. The federal government has been growing in significance and power, frankly, since the American Civil War. The Civil War ushered in a centralized federal government like never before for a whole set of obvious and important reasons. The Progressive era enhanced and grew the federal government even more because there was no other institution to try to blunt the ravages of industrialization and urbanization that were going on in the late 19th and early 20th century except government. Then we get the Great Depression, and what happens with the Great Depression? But the whole economy collapsed. The whole economic infrastructure collapsed. How do you rebuild? Well, there was no private money to rebuild with, so Keynesian economics was used, and we had something called the New Deal, which reshaped the United States forever. But now we've had a conservative politics. We've had a politics of reaction, if you like, in this country for at least the last 40 years that has systematically tried to dismantle that New Deal. So, in other words, any issue in the present, whether it's immigration, the role of government, health care, you name it, has a history. Social Security has a history. You know, there are those of us who believe it's a moral right, it's a moral duty of government to provide some kind of network or structure to support people in old age. I mean, it's become a basic liberty of industrial modern nations across the world. And yet the United States is still debating whether that's even a right to have. Most countries in the world, most advanced countries in the world, have some form of national health insurance. We're still debating whether that's a right. That's because of our history. It's always rooted somehow in our past. So, you know, in writing about how Americans faced the meaning of the Civil War at the Centennial is a way of coming now to our own time and asking, so how are we filtering or seeing or processing our own great debates today through this past? And you can take your pick, you know, whether it's states' rights or whether it's race, or how we still have such a devil of a time in this country even talking about the problem of slavery. America had, at the time of the Civil War, the most successful, the most powerful, the richest, and almost the largest system of slavery on planet Earth. American slaves in 1860 were worth approximately $3.5 billion as a financial asset. That was the single largest financial asset in the entire American economy. It was central to the functioning of the American economy. And yet we still have Americans who cannot seem to face the idea that that war was actually about slavery, and Southerners seceded, struck out for their own independence to try to preserve a slave society. We have a historical narrative in the United States where some people just cannot somehow fit that story into it. And here we are at the 150th anniversary of this, and we're still having that debate. The present is always there in any discussion of the past. And at times one does get frustrated because, as everyone knows, historians, trained historians, are by far not the strongest voice. I mean, we'd like to think we are, but of course we're not. We're not the strongest voice out there in forging these public memories. The stronger voices are politicians, filmmakers, and these days, forms of media. And our task, of course, is not only to write our books. I mean, that has to be our first task. It's the thing we're best at. And to teach our courses and to give our public lectures. We have to do the things we're best at as trained historians. But we also have to find ways to use our voices out in these new major forms of media to engage these debates, because otherwise you have a public debate over the past in America, and sometimes there's no real historian involved in that debate.